Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
They always did this thing where they'd call a family meeting like we were a well-oiled democracy, when in reality, my parents never wanted a discussion, they wanted compliance. So when I got the text that Sunday afternoon from my mom, saying, "Come by around 6, we have something exciting to share," I knew whatever it was, it had already been decided. I still brought wine, because I've learned that showing up with something makes it harder for people to walk all over you, even if just a little. Silly me. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I did book reports and learned fractions and cried over college rejection letters. While my mom poured me a glass of wine she never drank herself, and my dad folded his hands like we were about to negotiate a mortgage. And then Rachel walked in late, of course, in her usual dramatic entrance, oversized sunglasses indoors, and that overly sweet voice she uses when she's hiding something. I should have known right then. It wasn't a family meeting. It was an ambush, and I was the designated casualty. My mom started with, "We've all noticed Rachel's been under a lot of stress lately," which, in family code, translates roughly to "your sister threw another tantrum at brunch, and we're pretending it's a mental health crisis." My dad added, "And mental health is just as important as physical health," which made me want to laugh, because this was the same man who once told me panic attacks weren't real and that I just needed to go for a jog and toughen up. But now that Rachel was the one spiraling, suddenly the budget had room for compassion. "We've decided to send Rachel to Italy for a week," my mom said, as if this was some great act of humanitarianism and not a five-star European vacation. "Just her," she added quickly, before I could even glance up. "We're paying for it. Flights, hotel, everything. She needs this." I looked at Rachel. She didn't even pretend to look embarrassed. She just smiled that tight, guilty smile and tucked her hair behind her ear, like some fragile poet who'd suffered too much for too long. And then, as if to twist the knife just a little deeper, my mom turned to me and said, "And we were hoping you could stay at the house while we're gone and water the plants." I don't know what stung more, the entitlement in the ask, or the fact that none of them seemed to think it was remotely unfair. "No, we know this is a lot. No, thank you for always stepping up." Just a cheerful assumption that I'd step in and hold the fort, like I always did, so Golden Girl Rachel could heal by sipping Aperol spritzes in Florence. They didn't notice the way I blinked slowly, the way I traced the rim of my wine glass with my fingertip like I was trying not to shatter it. Maybe they did notice and just didn't care. My dad actually chuckled. "You won't have to do much," he said. "Just water the garden and keep the place tidy. You're always so good at that kind of thing." That kind of thing, like I was their housekeeper, their failsafe, the daughter who never complains because she knows it wouldn't change a damn thing. I nodded, because that's what I do. And because I needed time. Not to process, but to plan. They left 2 days later. Rachel posted a boomerang from the airport, her mimosa clinking with someone I didn't recognize. My parents sent me the alarm code and a checklist for the plants. Hydrangeas, succulents, 2 miserable orchids that hadn't bloomed since 2018. And I moved into their house that evening with a duffel bag and a backpack full of memories I hadn't asked to revisit. The house felt the same as always. Cold in the way that places filled with too much beige and too many unspoken things feel cold. I walked through the hallway where our family portraits hung, Rachel always in the middle, even as a baby. I paused at the bookshelf where my mother kept the important documents, which she once told me not to touch because it's complicated. The safe was still in the closet behind the coats. The key to it was in my father's desk drawer. He never changed the hiding place. He never thought he had to. That night, I sat in the living room, cross-legged on their carpet, and stared at the walls. I thought about all the ways I'd stayed quiet over the years. All the birthday calls that never came. The way they forgot to come to my gallery opening because Rachel had a migraine. The time my mom told me to stop trying to compete when I asked why Rachel got a car and I got bus fare. It wasn't about the Italy trip. Not really. That was just the match. I could have made a scene. Could have screamed at them in that kitchen, thrown the wine in someone's face, packed a bag, and gone no contact. But there was something cleaner about waiting. About taking what they gave me, the house keys, the checklist, the code, and using it for something smarter. Because if they thought I was going to sit there like some unpaid intern and spritz their dying succulents while Rachel toured the Coliseum on their dime, they were going to be in for one hell of a surprise. And the best part? They wouldn't even see it coming. It's easy for people on the outside to see moments like these, the Italy trip, the plant watering request, as isolated, even accidental lapses in judgment from otherwise well-meaning parents. But anyone who's lived under the same roof as a golden child knows that favoritism doesn't arrive one day with a trumpet and a crown. It creeps in like fog under a door, soft at first, nearly invisible, until the whole house smells like damp rot, and you're the only one who seems to notice. That conversation around the kitchen table wasn't a turning point. It was just the moment I decided to stop pretending it hadn't always been like this. Rachel was born 3 years after me, and even then, before she could talk or walk or lie, people already spoke about her like she had some shimmering aura the rest of us didn't. When she was 2 and I was 5, she screamed through an entire family wedding, and instead of apologizing, my mom laughed and said, "She just feels things so deeply, doesn't she?" I remember sitting at the kids' table in a scratchy dress that didn't fit right, watching everyone orbit around this tiny tyrant in a tulle skirt, wondering what exactly it was she felt so deeply that made the rest of us have to tiptoe. The truth is, Rachel didn't grow up learning how to manipulate people. She was simply never taught to care what her actions cost the rest of us. If she threw a tantrum, someone else got punished. If she failed a class, the teacher was blamed. If she broke something, I was the one they asked to help clean it up. The older I got, the more invisible my contributions became, not because I didn't try hard enough, but because the family machinery relied on me staying quiet so she could stay comfortable. And when you spend 2 decades being the dependable one, the one who doesn't ask for much, people stop checking if you need anything at all. They just assume you'll carry the load, even when it's breaking your back. I never went to prom because Rachel was going through something that spring and no one had the time to take me shopping for a dress. I didn't get a graduation party because my dad lost a client the same week Rachel got caught with weed in her backpack, and suddenly our house was a war zone of whispered accusations and dramatic exits. I paid for my own college textbooks while they bought her a therapy dog that she rehomed a month later because it wasn't vibing with her energy. These moments didn't crush me in the dramatic, scream into a pillow kind of way. They eroded me slowly, sanding down my sense of worth until I started measuring my value in terms of how little I asked for and how much I endured without complaint. So, when they sent her to Italy under the noble guise of mental health, it wasn't the extravagance that got to me. Though let's not pretend it didn't sting to hear them casually mention booking her a suite in Florence with a balcony view while I was told to check the succulents for gnats. No, what got to me was the ease with which they said it, the complete lack of shame or hesitation, like this was simply the natural order of things. Rachel receives and Amanda supports. Rachel breaks and Amanda patches. Rachel flies across the ocean and Amanda waters the fucking plants. There's something incredibly clarifying about reaching your breaking point not through fire or betrayal, but through boredom. That week, while they were abroad, was the quietest my life had felt in years. I didn't have to answer texts. I didn't have to fix anything. I didn't have to play along with their narrative about Rachel's fragility and their own helplessness. Instead, I walked through their house like a stranger with time to kill, opening drawers they never thought I'd notice, running my fingers over stacks of unopened mail, tax documents, home deeds, family photos that hadn't been updated since Obama's first term. I drank their good wine. I read Rachel's old journals, which were exactly as dramatic and self-obsessed as you'd expect. I sat in my mother's favorite reading chair and tried to remember the last time she asked me how I was doing, not in a polite, surface-level way, but really asked. I couldn't. The more I sat in their space, the more I realized how little space they'd ever given me. It was a house full of rules, but only for me. Expectations, but only when convenient. Love, but always conditional. Rachel could fail upward forever, and they'd find a poetic spin for it, but if I dared to show fatigue or frustration, I was met with furrowed brows and, Amanda, you need to be the bigger person. I used to believe that being the bigger person made me noble. Now I see it for what it is, an excuse to keep me compliant. Somewhere around day 4, as I was pruning the hydrangeas in the backyard, I had a thought that arrived not like a storm, but like a breeze. I didn't want revenge, not really, I wanted release. I didn't want to scream or break things or humiliate anyone. I just wanted out. Out of the role they wrote for me, out of the endless emotional bartering, out of the suffocating responsibility of being the one who always understood. And then another thought followed close behind, this one heavier and more precise. Maybe I already had the tools to walk away. I just needed to stop asking for permission. That night, I logged into my bank account and stared at the numbers. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't broke. I'd been saving for a long time, not for a house or a wedding, but for the day I'd finally stop being afraid of disappointing them. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next, but I knew what I wasn't going to do anymore. I wasn't going to explain. I wasn't going to apologize. I wasn't going to play dumb. They were still in Italy, tagging Rachel in stories about gelato and museums, as if they were celebrating the triumph of a long-fought battle rather than funding a glorified vacation for someone who had mastered the art of strategic vulnerability. And I was sitting in their kitchen with their keys, their schedule, their address, and just enough detachment to finally make a move that wouldn't be loud, but would be permanent. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can do is simply not be there when they come looking. And I was already planning where I'd go next, not to run, but to start somewhere new, somewhere I wasn't the default caretaker for people who never saw me. Let them drink wine under the Tuscan sun. I had work to do. And I intended to make the silence echo. There's a strange sort of power in walking through a place that used to belong to your parents and realizing, for the first time, that it no longer feels like theirs, that every framed photo, every decorative bowl filled with potpourri, every laminated emergency contact list taped inside a kitchen cabinet starts to look more like evidence than comfort, and the house begins to reveal itself not as a sanctuary, but as a long-maintained illusion of control. I didn't touch anything at first, not because I felt guilt, but because I wanted to observe, to understand the structure of the world they had built without ever consulting me. I moved from room to room like a forensic scientist, as if I could reconstruct the narrative of my own erasure by studying their choices, their habits, their little rituals that never once included asking me what I wanted. My mother always kept things meticulously labeled. Every folder had a name. Every drawer was arranged in a specific pattern. I used to think that was impressive, but now it just looked desperate, like someone trying to control the uncontrollable by putting masking tape labels on everything that could be alphabetized. I found the paperwork within the first hour of really looking. Tucked in the back of a metal filing cabinet in the office, beneath a folder labeled Home Equity Line of Credit, was a manila envelope filled with signatures and legal documents that, quite frankly, they probably assumed I'd forgotten about. Or maybe they just never expected I'd understand them. The truth was, after the divorce, the house had technically been in my name, not in some dramatic inheritance twist, but because years ago, when things got tight financially, I had been the only one in the family with a high enough credit score and stable income to refinance the place. I remember it now, vividly. My father calling me in a panic, the bank threatening foreclosure, the teary phone calls, the reassurances that it was just temporary, that they'd change it back once things were stable. But they never did. And I never pushed the issue, because at the time I thought love looked like sacrifice, like helping them when they were down and asking for nothing in return. I didn't think they owed me anything, because that's what they had taught me to believe, that being a good daughter meant being useful, not compensated. It wasn't until I sat there at their dining room table, holding the deed in my hand, that I understood how much I'd been manipulated into normalizing my own silence. It wasn't about the house, not really, it was about the story they had always told, the one where they were the generous caretakers and I was the reliable support beam. But the paper didn't lie. The house was mine. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, not symbolically. Legally. And that changed everything. I didn't pack anything. I didn't smash anything. I didn't write a note. What I did, instead, was call a locksmith. The man arrived early the next morning, gruff and efficient, and when he asked why I wanted to change the locks, I simply said, "Family emergency." He didn't ask anything else. He changed the front, the back, and the side door. Every point of entry now had a fresh mechanism and a new key. I held the cool metal in my palm for a long time after he left, marveling at how small a thing it was, how light, how insignificant it looked, and yet how profoundly it could alter the meaning of who belonged and who didn't. That afternoon, I sold my own house, or rather, I initiated the process, called the agent I had used years ago, and told her I was ready. I told her I wouldn't be buying again, not yet. I didn't tell her where I was going because, frankly, I didn't know. But I knew what I wasn't doing. I wasn't sitting around in a place filled with memories of staying silent, waiting for someone else to decide I mattered. I took my laptop and a few essential things, clothes, documents, my grandmother's old locket, and I left. Not dramatically. Not impulsively. Calmly, with purpose. I booked a small cabin up north, near Lake Willoughby, a place I remembered from a childhood vacation, one of the few where Rachel hadn't come because she had summer dance camp, and it had been the first time I remembered my parents laughing without tension. I always liked it there. It felt quiet, clean, like a place where no one knew me as the responsible one or the forgotten one or anything at all. I didn't tell anyone where I was going because I knew that once my parents and Rachel came home, they'd make it about them. They'd twist it. They'd dramatize. They'd center themselves in my story the same way they always had, and I wanted to rob them of that satisfaction. I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to give them an opportunity to reinterpret the truth. I wanted them to come home and find something missing, not their things, not their furniture, but me. They were still in Rome the last time I checked, taking a pasta-making class, Rachel posting filtered selfies with captions about healing energy and finally feeling aligned. I stared at the photo of her holding a glass of wine with a practiced, effortless grin, and I thought about all the times I had waited for them to realize what they were doing, to wake up and apologize or at least ask. They never did. And now, finally, they would be forced to ask. Not because I demanded it, but because the door would not open. The house still had their furniture, their clothes, their plants. I watered them one last time, not out of duty but to leave no trace. I made the bed. I cleaned the counters. I took out the trash. I wanted it to look exactly as they left it, except for one very specific difference. They couldn't get inside anymore. And when they landed and tried their old keys, when they turned the knob and nothing gave way, when the familiar beep of the keypad failed to register because the code had been changed, when they stood on that front porch confused and betrayed and disoriented, I wouldn't be watching. I wouldn't be answering their calls. I wouldn't be anywhere near the wreckage. I didn't need to see their faces to know what it would feel like. For the first time, they would feel the absence of me. And that, more than any confrontation or shouted accusation, was the purest form of revenge I could imagine. They left me behind for a vacation. I left them behind for good. It's a strange and almost poetic sort of satisfaction to imagine the exact moment when someone opens a door they've entered 1,000 times before, often without thinking, without knocking, without asking who might be on the other side, and finds that the key, the one they've always assumed would work, no longer fits in the lock they never considered could be changed. I don't know if it was my father or my mother who tried it first, who stood in front of that familiar brass doorknob, bags at their feet, jet lag in their bones, probably still drunk off duty-free Prosecco and the glow of an overpriced Italian vacation, and who felt that sharp, disoriented panic crawl up their throat when the lock refused them entry. I imagine there was a pause, just a moment, where they looked at each other, still clinging to the illusion that this was all some small mistake, that maybe they were using the wrong key, maybe the door had swollen in the summer heat, maybe Amanda must have made a mistake. But I hadn't made a mistake. I had made a decision. A firm, irrevocable, deeply overdue decision. They had landed the night before, but I didn't get the first call until 10 in the morning. It was my mother, her voice already laced with that breathless panic she tries to disguise as cheerful concern, the kind she uses when Rachel's in crisis and she's trying to get ahead of the narrative. "Sweetie," she said, as if we'd spoken yesterday, as if I hadn't spent 7 days in their house realizing I didn't owe them anything anymore. "We're back, and there's a little issue with the door. Could you come by and bring the spare key?" I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then I hung up. Not rudely, not with fury, but with something colder and more absolute, the kind of silence that says, "You've had your turn." They called again, then again. My father tried next, his voice more clipped, laced with that military disappointment he wielded so easily when we were children, the tone that always meant you're making this harder than it needs to be. But this time, I wasn't 10 years old, and there was no science project to be fixed or shoe to be tied. This time, the problem was theirs, and I wasn't going to be the solution. By the time they called the police, which they inevitably did, I was already in another zip code. The officer, polite but uninterested, probably asked to see some paperwork. My father would have tried to show him old mail, a driver's license, maybe even the original mortgage agreement. But none of that would have mattered, not in the face of the updated deed with my name printed clearly at the top, signed and notarized, filed with the county clerk, logged and certified. There's a particular humiliation in discovering that your authority has not only been revoked, but replaced, that the foundation of your identity, the home you assumed would always be yours, is now legally someone else's property. And that someone, that silent shadow you never thought to fear, is your eldest daughter, the one you stopped really seeing a long time ago. Rachel, according to the message she left me at 2 in the afternoon, was sobbing. Her voicemail began with hiccuped tears and ended in the kind of theatrical, self-centered outrage I'd come to expect from her. "How could you do this to Mom?" she cried. As if my mother were some fragile artifact instead of a willing architect of the very system that shaped us both so differently. As if this wasn't the most predictable consequence of years spent investing only in the child who cried the loudest. I listened to the message once, then deleted it. There was nothing in it I hadn't already heard 100 different ways. Rachel's voice, trembling with entitlement, always just seconds away from making her hurt the center of the universe. The neighbors noticed, of course. They always do. I can only imagine how the scene looked from across the street, the suitcases on the porch, my father pacing like a man robbed in broad daylight, my mother trying to make calls, Rachel crying on the steps with smudged mascara and a $1,000 handbag at her feet. Suburbia thrives on spectacle, and I'd given them one. I didn't feel guilty about it. If anything, I felt relieved, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because for once, they were being forced to sit with the consequences of their own mythology, stripped of their usual audience, with no script to fall back on. I sent a single text that evening. Not to Rachel, not to my father. To my mother. It read, simply, "You taught me." That was all. No explanation, no threats, no justification. Just a simple reminder that everything I'd done, every locked door, every unanswered call, every quiet step into freedom, was a direct reflection of what they had always asked of me, to be responsible, to think ahead, to take care of what matters, to protect what's mine. And, for the first time, I'd done exactly that, not for them, but for myself. The silence that followed was almost deafening. No more calls. No more texts. Just a void, thick with the weight of confusion, disbelief, and, I suspect, something they hadn't felt in years, fear. Not the fear of danger, but the fear of irrelevance. Because they weren't just locked out of the house. They were locked out of the version of me that played along. I didn't check the local news, though I wouldn't be surprised if some nosy neighbor called it in. I didn't respond to the emails, the vague legal threats, the veiled appeals to talk this through. There was nothing to talk about. Every conversation we could have had was one they refused to engage in for 30 years, and I was done translating my pain into something palatable for people who only ever tasted it when it benefited them. I heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that they were staying at a hotel on Route 7. Not the fancy one. A cheap one with outdated floral bedspreads and a breakfast bar that shuts down at 8:30. The thought didn't give me joy, but it did give me peace. They had finally been forced to look at each other without me there to hold the space between them. Without me playing translator, peacemaker, buffer. Just the three of them, sitting in a motel room with nothing but the echo of their choices. And me? I was gone. Not missing, not angry, not broken. Just gone. There's a particular kind of clarity that settles over you when you finally stop waiting for someone to understand what they've done. Not because you've forgiven them, and not because it doesn't matter anymore, but because the act of waiting itself becomes another form of submission, a slow drip poison that dulls your instincts and convinces you that closure is something owed rather than something claimed. I didn't want their apology anymore, not because it wouldn't have been nice to hear, but because I had realized, far too late and yet exactly on time, that people like my parents don't apologize in ways that heal, they apologize in ways that neutralize. That rewrite the story just enough so they can continue believing they were good parents who simply made a few unfortunate decisions in moments of stress, never bad enough to warrant distance, always just sympathetic enough to keep the guilt from tipping into accountability. So no, I didn't miss them. And I didn't miss the sound of my mother's voice calling me sweetie only when she wanted something, or the way my father used to offer support like it was a favor instead of a responsibility, or the never-ending stream of Rachel's crises dressed up as spiritual awakenings, always timed perfectly to overshadow anything I might have dared to need. What I missed, and this hit me one morning while I stood barefoot on the deck of the cabin, coffee cooling in my hand, watching a heron glide across the mirror of the lake, was the version of myself I might have been if they had loved me fairly, not perfectly. Just fairly, in the kind of quiet, consistent way that doesn't need explanations or earned loyalty, the kind of love that doesn't turn into currency or obligation. But that version of me, the one who believed she was worth equal space, had been buried so early and so gently that it had taken me years to notice her absence. And still, even with that truth sitting heavy in my chest like a rock in deep water, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't seeking revenge. I had already had mine, and it wasn't in the changing of locks or the silence of my departure, it was in the stillness that followed, in the knowledge that for the first time, I had stepped out of the endless loop of cause and effect, hurt and repair and chosen. Deliberately, not to play the part they had assigned me. I had given them everything they'd asked for over the years, my time, my patience, my compliance, my silence, and now, finally, I had given them the one thing they never expected, nothing. The message from our old neighbor came on a Tuesday afternoon, in the form of a grainy video recorded from behind a curtain, a shaky little film starring the three of them standing on the front lawn of the house that was no longer theirs, shouting into the void and waving their arms like people who still believed that noise was the same as power. My mother was pacing the driveway with her phone pressed to her ear, likely trying to reach a lawyer who hadn't answered her calls in days. My father stood with his hands on his hips, the exact pose he used to adopt when I brought home anything less than an A. Rachel was crouched on the bottom step, her face buried in her hands, performing her devastation with all the subtlety of a B-list actress in a bad drama. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so familiar. I watched the video only once, not out of malice, but curiosity. I needed to see, with my own eyes, what absence looked like from the outside. I needed to witness, in real time, the gap I'd left behind, not as a wound but as proof. Proof that I had, in fact, been holding it all together. Proof that I wasn't invisible, that my quiet labor and emotional buffering hadn't gone unnoticed, but rather had been the only thing keeping the entire machine from falling apart. And now, with me gone, it was all unraveling, not in an explosion, but in the slow, unglamorous collapse of people who had never learned to carry their own weight. They didn't know where I was, and they didn't need to. The point wasn't to disappear entirely. It was to become unreachable in the way they had always been to me. Emotionally, spiritually, morally unreachable. I didn't need to live off the grid or change my name or burn bridges. I just needed to stop answering. To stop explaining. To stop pretending that their inability to see me was something I had the power to fix. Sometimes I thought about going back, not to the house, but to them, just once, to watch their faces as I stood in front of them not as the dutiful daughter or the responsible sister, but as someone fully formed and uninterested in making them comfortable. I imagined the conversation, how they'd try to reshape the past into something more forgivable, how Rachel would cry and say she never meant to take so much, how my mother would use words like family and healing as though they were tools instead of weapons. My father would probably sit there, arms crossed, waiting for me to be reasonable, as if reason was ever enough to soothe a lifetime of being treated like a supporting character in my own life. But every time I imagined it, I walked away before it ended. I didn't need to watch it fall apart again. I already knew the ending. Instead, I wrote them a letter. Not to send, I never intended to send it, but to say the things I never had the space to say. It was long, full of specifics, filled with the kind of cold clarity that doesn't beg for recognition. I wrote about the time they made me give up my spot at art camp because Rachel had mono. I wrote about the way they laughed when I said I wanted to move to New York and told me I'd never survive in a cutthroat place like that. I wrote about the birthdays they forgot, the holidays I spent alone, the way they always asked what I was doing for work, but never how I was doing in general. I wrote about how exhausting it is to be the strong one, not because you're built for it, but because everyone else decided you'd handle it better. I folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and tucked it in the back of a drawer. It was enough that it existed. My last supper with them had happened long before Italy. Probably years earlier, at a table where I sat quietly while Rachel monopolized the conversation and my parents smiled and nodded like background actors. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no final dinner where truths spilled like wine and plates shattered in catharsis. That kind of ending would require them to admit they had something to answer for. No, my last supper had already passed, unnoticed by everyone but me, and I hadn't missed a thing. So now, when people ask if I talk to my family, I say no, without explanation. Not because I'm angry and not because I'm broken, but because I chose something better. I chose silence that heals instead of words that wound. I chose absence over resentment. I chose myself, maybe for the first time, maybe too late, but completely. And if one day I call them again, or write, or show up, it won't be to ask for anything. It won't be to explain what I did or why. It will be, if anything, to remind them of what happens when the quiet one finally walks away and no one bothers to follow. Because the truth is, I was never the backup plan. I was the whole damn foundation. And they didn't realize that until it was already gone.